Welcome to this IHS GlobalSpec Oil and Gas Technology online event. OPC UA's adoption of today's widespread IT principles and techniques also promises the secure transmission of data over public domains to protect authenticity, integrity, and confidentiality. Now, before this presentation, we'd like to invite you to submit questions at any point by using the Submit Question button at the base of this video console. Also, some of the presentations you will see today include detailed information. So we would encourage you to click the Download PPT button so that you can follow along with your own copy of the PowerPoint slides. Aron Semle is Product Manager at Kepware Technologies. He's passionate about using new technology to solve modern-day problems in data collection and about growing a world-class software company in Portland, Maine. Aron, welcome to today's event.
Hi, my name is Aron Semle. I'm a product manager at Kepware Technologies. Today, it's my pleasure to be here to talk about the contents of a white paper that I co-authored with our CEO Tony Paine titled Leveraging OPC UA to Help Manage Site Security Requirements. So looking at the overview, I'm going to start with a one-slide presentation on Kepware Technologies, who we are, what we do. I will then move on to the contents of the white paper, so the need for security, why we need that, common security objectives and threats that make achieving those objectives difficult. We'll talk about site security and what sites are doing today to manage security. And then we'll also look at OPC UA as a technology to help sites meet their security needs. We'll wrap it up with a summary of the presentation, and then we'll open it up for some questions at the end. So, Kepware Technologies. Kepware Technologies is a company that's focused on commercial off-the-shelf communication software for any automated solution. So what does that mean? Well, typically in any environment you'll find hardware and software from a number of different vendors, right? And to automate that process, you need to get all that equipment talking together. So typically a hardware vendor is going to expose a serial port or an Ethernet port that supports one or more protocols to be able to read and write data to their devices. On the software side, you'll see them expose an API that roughly does the same thing. So Kepware's core competence is in connecting these disparate protocols so that it appears from the customer's perspective that all this different hardware and software just talks together. So we're the communications glue that ties this information all together. Kepware is a global company, so we sell globally. We have distributors that distribute, sell, and support the product in regions. We have systems integrators who standardize on the software for their particular projects, and we also have OEM vendors who will rely on us for an end-to-end connectivity to all the different types of equipment that's out there. Kepware is a company located in Portland, Maine on the East Coast, right in the Atlantic. We employ today currently 85 people, and we're growing steadily. We support, spec out, design, sell, and market the product all from Portland, Maine. So my pitch for Portland, if you haven't been here, it's a beautiful city. You should come pay us a visit, probably not in the winter, come in the summer when it's nice. So let's jump into the contents of the white paper. So what is the need for security? Why do we care? So we're in an information-driven economy, right? We need to be able to get information to decision makers so they can make the best decision for their business. Now, you know, no company is going to create a private network that spans the globe so they can get information from a site to Greg, who happens to be out in the West Coast, right? It's just not practical. So in order to share this information globally, we need to use public domains. So like the internet is the main public domain. So anytime we're sharing information over the internet, security becomes a huge concern, right? If this information is important to us, it's probably important to other people as well, and it's a huge security concern. So that creates the need for security. We need to get this information in real time to decision makers globally, and when we do that, we need to secure our site such that we're only allowing authenticated people and people we trust to access the information. So that is the necessity for security. So let's look at some security objectives. So if I'm a site, you know, what am I concerned about in terms of security? What am I trying to achieve? The first is auditability. Right? This is basically, if I'm going to allow remote communications with my site, I want to track all the communications that are occurring. And I'm going to do this for two reasons. There's a proactive reason I'll do it, and there's a reactive reason. Proactively, right, if I'm logging all the communications to this site and something doesn't quite look right, it could be a malicious attack. And if I can detect that, I can then thwart the attack and hopefully stop information from being leaked or some catastrophic event from occurring. Reactively, in the unfortunate event that I am hacked, right, and someone is able to steal information, I at least have the logs that I can go back through and try to figure out who that attacker was, what the vector of attack they used, and then I can build up defenses for it in the future. So auditability is a core security objective for sites. Moving on, we'll look at authentication, right? You can't trust just anyone, right? You wish you could, but you can't. So if you're a site, one of the main things you can do is you can limit the ability for anyone to connect to you. I mean, you're basically publicly facing. Anyone on the internet can ping you and connect with you. So if you can limit the ability of who's actually connecting to you, you can reduce your attack surface and increase the security of the site. So authentication, username and password credentials are very important. Beyond that is authority, right? Just because I gave you the keys to the castle doesn't mean I'm going to give you the keys to every door in it, right? So essentially, although you're an authenticated user, I'm going to use a less is more kind of policy where I'm going to limit your abilities to read and write data to the least amount you need to get the job done. So I might have administrators that have open access. I might have employees that have restricted access. I might have contractors that have even more restricted access. And it's not that I don't inherently trust these people that are authenticated. It's more I don't want them to shoot themselves in the foot, right? I don't want them to make a catastrophic mistake that causes a plant down or a loss of life scenario. So I'm going to limit what they can do to protect themselves. So let's look at, there's 3 more security objectives we can look at. So another one is availability, right? If I'm saying that it's important to get Greg this information in real time so he can make decisions, it's critically important that the system doesn't go down and he doesn't get access to the information, right? I need to make sure the system has 24-hour uptime all the time. In terms of security objective, that's kind of difficult, right? Because we're saying that there's a part of this public domain, the internet, that we don't control, that we're concerned about in terms of security, but we don't control whether or not that's up or down. So what we need to do is we need to look at everything up to where we transfer information over the public domain, and we need to make that highly available. So if we have a lot of requests for information, a lot of requests for reads, we need to make sure that that system can maintain that load and operate so Greg can get his information when he needs it. And then there's confidentiality. We talked about this a little bit, but we're sending data over the wire, right? We don't want just anyone to have access to that data. We want to make sure that if we're sending Greg critical process information for the site, that Greg is the only person that can read that information, right? If someone else were to eavesdrop or snoop that data, they couldn't make any sense of it. So confidentiality is a big deal in terms of securing your intellectual property. And last is integrity. Just because you're sending a message and it's confidential doesn't mean I as a hacker can't intercept that message and play around with it. I can start tweaking some bits here and there, right? If I send someone a message that says attack at dawn and they get it and it says attack at noon, that's a miscommunication. We could run into some trouble there, right? So we need to make sure that not only is the message confidential that we send to Greg, but when Greg gets that message, he's ensured that it's exactly what we sent him and it hasn't been tampered with. So that's kind of a quick overview of security objectives. We covered 6 of those. Let's look at the security threats. These are pretty interesting. These are the things that make achieving those objectives difficult. So the first one is compromising user credentials. This is the easiest one to think about, right? We use username and password all over the place to access our bank account. If that information were to leak and someone were to get our credentials, suddenly they are authenticated into the system and they have the access as if they were us, right? Same applies for control systems and sites. If user credentials are just insecure, if they're not using strong passwords, if they get leaked, there's also the case in our space where we're not lazy, right? That's not it, but you install a piece of equipment, it works, and you're a busy guy, you walk away, you got to do something else, right? A lot of times this equipment will have default password settings, and we have a tendency in our space not to change those. So that's just as good as no password at all. Those default passwords are publicly documented. As an attacker, I could get into that system, use a default name and password, and be fully authenticated into the system. So user credentials and having minimum requirements on how difficult those should be are really important. Otherwise, people can get in completely authorized and with all the authority that you don't want them to have. Another threat is eavesdropping. We're sending this information over a public domain. It's fairly trivial for me to get on the network that you're on and sniff all the traffic that you're sending. I can't necessarily do anything with it, but just the fact that I can collect it is a big concern, right? Because the question is, once I've collected it, what can I do after that? And we'll see that in a few more of these threats as we go through. But the potential to eavesdrop, it's fairly trivial to do that. So we do have to have that concern. So if I do eavesdrop, one thing I can do is I capture a bunch of your messages. You can use malform messages. So basically, I'm going to go through kind of ties into the integrity story, but I'm going to go through and I'm going to start tweaking some bits in the packet, in the message that you sent, right? And don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm just kind of messing with the system, and then I'm going to take those messages and I'm going to send them back to you. And my intent there as an attacker is I'm going to try to cause you to waste a ton of time processing my bogus messages, or I'm going to try to cause your system to crash or do something bad to reduce your availability. So that's generally called like a denial of service attack, where I'm going to tweak these messages and I'm going to send them to you in hopes that you kind of trip up on them. So that's part of eavesdropping after I've eavesdropped. We'll talk about another one, message alteration and spoofing. It's kind of like malformed messages, but it's a little different. A lot of the protocols that we support, Modbus, DNP, that are used in control systems, and many more, they're publicly documented. It's trivial for me to go online and Google this protocol and understand, okay, this is how the packet looks like, this is the information in it. When I have that information, I can then go craft these custom messages based on the protocol, and kind of like malformed messages, I can start to tweak bits and pull things out of the ordinary. Like if I'm only supposed to send you a string with 255 characters, I could send you a string with 256, and I'm just going to see what you do when I send that. Worst case, you'll crash, right? And then the availability of the system just went kapoof. So malformed and spoofing, it's like I'm doing kind of like malformed messages, but in the message alteration case, spoofing, I have some more intelligence of what I'm doing. So it's a little more dangerous, a little more evolved. Message flooding, this one's kind of cool, right? Because this takes no knowledge of what the control system's sending or receiving. Basically, message flooding is I'm going to machine gun messages as fast as I can to your server or your site. And I might tweak those messages to try to make you spend a lot of time processing them. But at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do is I'm sending you so much information, and your server's sitting there trying to juggle it, and it's all bogus, right? So when Greg makes his request for data or a write, I'm actually going to drop that request because I'm so busy trying to handle all this bogus information that's being sent to me. So that's message flooding. It's botnets do that in some cases. It's a fairly simple attack that can have some devastating consequences. The last one, or not the last one on this slide anyway, that we'll talk about is message replay. This is, again, is a pretty unsophisticated attack that can have some devastating consequences. So if I eavesdrop and capture all the messages that are sending between the site and the user, I can then just replay those back, right? I can just send them back to the server and see what happens. In the case where it's a read command and I'm reading some data at the site, the read command might complete, I get the data back. Not a huge deal, right? In the case where it's a write command, I'm actually controlling state at the site. If I replay that and I close a valve that was supposed to relieve pressure from a tank and the tank blows up, I mean, that's a big concern. That's a loss of life scenario, right? So message replay is a very simplistic attack, which if it's not countered against, can have some devastating consequences. And the hacker's not going to know what they're doing, right? They're just going to replay messages and they have no idea what's going on. So we'll cover two more security threats. It's a little more sophisticated. We'll talk about profiling. So there's a number of organizations, ICS CERT being one of the bigger ones, that does a phenomenal job at documenting vulnerabilities in hardware and software. ICS CERT specifically in the control space. So what these guys do is if they discover, or someone discovers a security vulnerability in a piece of software or hardware, they'll approach the vendor and they'll say, hey, this vulnerability exists, let's get it cleaned up. The vendor will typically produce a patch, right? And then ICS CERT will go out and say, okay, we discovered this vulnerability in this piece of hardware, software, this model number, this firmware revision, everything the customer would need to know to identify the equipment at their site that has the issue. And then the intention is that by broadcasting that, everyone who manages these sites will say, okay, we got to go patch these systems to remove this vulnerability. And that's great. We need that, right? But inevitably, it's a little more difficult than that. These sites have 24-hour uptime requirements. Sometimes there's a mentality that we're small and we're not going to be attacked, so why would we bother applying all these patches? So end of the day, the patches sometimes don't get applied. And if I'm a hacker, that's a huge, that's a gold mine for me, right? If I can remotely look at your site and profile your site, and I can find some equipment that I know has a known vulnerability, and I have a documented exploit, I can just exploit that vulnerability, right? I don't have to do any work. The work's already been done for me. So profiling is somewhat more sophisticated. They have to do a lot more research to figure that out. But in the event that systems aren't patched, it's an easy way to attack a system. So the last one is session hijacking. This one's kind of like if you had an ID to swipe to get into your building at work and you went up and you swiped it, and you went to, as soon as you swiped it clicked and said, okay, you can come in, and I jumped in and I ran in front of you and closed the door behind me, I just hijacked your session, right? What you did is you authenticated with the building, you said, I'm authorized to be here, and I just swooped in after you did that and took your spot. Now I'm in the building, as long as I act kosher and I'm not abnormal and people think I belong there, then I'm fine. It's the same concept with session hijacking. Basically, the client is communicating with the server, the client does everything he needs to do to authenticate and authorize with the server, and then the attacker just comes in and takes the identity, right? And then at that point, he's completely authorized and authenticated with the system. So that's a little more advanced attack to pull off, but it's a big security threat. So we looked at security objectives that the sites want to accomplish. We've identified a number of 8 threats that make achieving those objectives difficult. So let's look at site security in general. Like what are folks doing at remote sites or sites in general to accomplish security today? So one is a cybersecurity management system. This is really a plan that a site would have in place that would identify all the objectives that we covered that are their concerns. So what do we want to achieve? And then identify all the threats that they're susceptible to and how they want to respond to that. Now, every site should have this. In reality, there's a lot of standards organizations that require them to. So NERC CIP is a critical infrastructure protection standard through the energy reliability, right? And that mandates that any substation, et cetera, any power generation facility needs to have a plan in place to deal with security threats. It needs to be inherently secure. So a lot of times it's done. These kind of security systems, they're going to deal with 2 things. They're going to deal with the electronic boundary, right? So this is the electronic system. We're going to secure that, get all the communications out. It'll also deal with physical things like physical access to the site, swiping your card to get in, that kind of requirements. So the whole idea is we're going to plan up front and how we're going to prevent, what objectives we're going to achieve and how we're going to prevent attacks. The other thing that sites do, and this is very common throughout the industry, is defense in depth, right? So the term defense in depth is coined. It's basically the concept of there's no single line of defense for security. And the best historical example that's often given for this is the Maginot Line in France. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but essentially after World War I, France built a defensive wall called the Maginot Line with the border of Germany, with the intention that if Germany were to attack again, we would have this brilliant fortification over the border that would completely thwart off any attack, right? It was a brilliant design. It was completely impenetrable. Well, it was a single line of defense, and when Germany in World War II decided to invade France, what they did is they went north of the Maginot Line, went through Belgium, and conquered France in 6 weeks, right? So that's the classic example of a single line of defense is not a good defensive strategy. So defense in depth says that what we're going to do is we're going to create multiple layers of defense with the idea that maybe we can prevent the attack. If we can't prevent the attack, at least we can slow it down so that we can detect it while it's happening, right? And limit their access to information. So a defense in depth strategy at a site would include things like, we're going to have firewall rules. We'll have intrusion detection systems which can monitor traffic and figure out when things don't quite look right. We might have patch management rules, et cetera. So a bunch of layers of defense to basically thwart off attacks. So we looked at objectives, we looked at threats, we looked at how sites today manage security. Now let's kind of pivot and look at OPC UA. So how does OPC UA provide a security mechanism for sites when they need to transfer information over public domains? We'll start with kind of a high-level look at OPC UA, so the different layers of UA from a security perspective and how it actually implements security. So OPC UA really has 3 layers we'll talk about. There's an applications layer, there's a communications layer, and then there's a transport layer. So all these layers they're required to implement a UA server to spec, but they're fairly independent. So the beauty of UA is they can extend them to future security requirements. But let's look at the requirements that they cover today. So the applications layer is really the layer that has all like the business logic, everything you can do in UA. So you can browse data at the site, you can read or write data at the site, you can model information at the site through UA, you can access real-time data, historical data, alarms and events data. This is all application layer stuff that you can do. The security piece of it, in the application layer, there's the idea of a secure session. So this is basically saying that anyone that connects to me, I need to ID them. So they need to provide some credentials, and I'll authenticate them into the system, and I'll give them some level of authorization. So we'll get into a little more detail in a few slides as to in terms of how that works, but essentially it's in the application layer. The communications layer is home of what UA calls the secure channel, right? So this is like you can think of it as a logical connection. Logical, it's like made up, right? We made it up in software. So the physical connection is the TCP IP port that we're connecting over from the client to the server. The logical connection is this secure channel. So essentially what this secure channel is responsible for is encrypting and decrypting the information that's sent between the client and the server and negotiating what that looks like. And at this point, that's all we need to know. We'll get into more detail on how that works in a few slides. And lastly is the transport layer. This is the layer that Kepware gets most excited about, right? Because we're all about bits and bytes and sending stuff over the wire, and that's what the transport layer is. So the transport layer can be a secure medium or an insecure medium. So secure, you're talking OpenSSL, or not OpenSSL, you're talking about SSL or HTTPS. Insecure, it's the TCP, UDP, HTTP. So this is where the bits and bytes are sent. The transport does somewhat affect how the secure channel is set up, but there still is a secure channel, so we'll see that in the communications layer. So one pivotal thing that the controls folks need to understand when they approach OPC UA is this idea of certificates. Now this comes from the IT space, right? We're not stealing it, we're borrowing it from the IT space. It's a great technology for security, but it's somewhat new to us, right? So before I even really get into the contents of this slide, I'll give you an analogy. When you go to google.com, you get redirected to https at google.com, right? And what that is it's a secure link for Google. Now what's happening is when you communicate with Google, they're sending you back what's called this X509 certificate. And that certificate is a file that identifies everything that you need to know that it's Google you're talking with. And then your browser gets that and it says, okay, do I trust this site? And the way that works is the certificate that Google sends you is actually signed by a certificate authority called GeoTrust. And all browsers trust GeoTrust, so in association we also trust Google. So I trust Steve, he's my best friend. Steve knows Fred. I inherently trust Fred because Steve vouches for Fred. That's the kind of logic that goes on. So these certificates are used then not only authenticate or authorize that Google is a valid site to be communicating with, after that it actually secures the connection. So UA uses that same certificate technology to both identify and encrypt information sent between client and server. The difference between UA and the Google case is that UA actually requires the server to trust the client and the client to trust the server. That's different from the internet case because billions of clients connect to Google, right? Google doesn't want to have to trust every client that connects to them. In UA, that's not the case. You usually have a subset or some number of clients, and security is even more important, so you want to make sure that both sides trust each other when they make the connection. So back to the slide quick. So these X509 certificates, they're called instant certificates. So if I took a piece of software from a vendor and I installed it on two systems, they'd get their own unique instant certificate, right? That would be unique globally to identify them. And these are typically self-signed, which means unlike the Google case where they're signed by GeoTrust, these are self-signed, so they trust themselves, which means that we actually have to exchange all these certificates between clients and servers for them to trust each other. So they have to have the individual certificates. So one thing that most UA servers or applications support is the ability to replace these certificates. So we don't need to use the out-of-the-box ones, right? And also the ability to replace them with ones that are signed by a certificate authority similar to GeoTrust. So we don't have to have every client trust every server, we just have to have everyone trust this certificate authority and they inherently trust each other. Certificates they consist of public and private keys. The public key is the one that I give to everybody. Everyone has the public key. The private key is the one that I have to hold and keep near and dear to my heart because if that got out, it completely defeats the purpose of certificates. Essentially, the public and private keys are large primary numbers that are really hard to guess. The bigger the number, the harder it is to guess. So UA uses this technology, and then let's look at how it actually uses it to secure communications between a client and a server. So when a client connects to a server over UA, one of the first things it does is it creates a secure channel, which we talked about, right? And this is used to negotiate and encrypt and decrypt the communications. This is probably the most challenging part of the UA topic. So if you can get past this, after this, it's all downhill from here. We're doing great. So if you can get this concept, it's awesome. Essentially, the way this works is when the client connects to the server, both have their own instance certificates. When the client goes to send information to the server, what it's going to do is it's going to actually encrypt the information with the server's public key. Okay? So this information is encrypted over the wire. No one can really understand it because I've encrypted it with this guy's public key, which he sent out to everybody. Everybody has that. The idea is that only the private key can be used to decrypt that information. And since the server is keeping that piece near and dear to its heart, not letting anyone know, the server is the only one that can decrypt that packet. So what I've ensured is confidentiality of the message, right? By using the server's public key to sign the message and having him, to encrypt the message and having him decrypt it with his private key, he's the only one that can do that. And then it can go the other way too when the server sends a message to the client. So that applies confidentiality. No one can understand that message other than the server when I send it. The other piece of it is the signing, right? I want to ensure integrity. So the server wants to know that I'm the guy that actually sent that message and it's not from anybody else. And the way I do that is after I do the encryption of the message, I actually sign the message with the client's private key. So the client will sign it with his private key, which only he has, right? He'll send it over the wire to the server, and the server will use the client's public key to check the signature. And he knows it came from the client because the client was the only one that could sign it because he's the only one that knows his private key. So take a deep breath. Hopefully you understood that. It's a very dense topic, but essentially that secure channel and the communication and the use of these private and public keys allow for confidentiality of the information we're exchanging and integrity of the information we're exchanging. And so the other piece of that is in reality, that's called asymmetric encryption, that technology. And it's fairly imperformant and slow to do. So what UA actually does is when it sets up the secure channel, it relies on this asymmetric cryptography to actually send what is called a symmetric key across, which both client and server can use. And then after that, they use that key to communicate, and it's much faster. Messages are still encrypted, it's just not as strong of an encryption. So UA will also renew the secure channel at a certain rate. So in the event that we secured the channel and in some hour someone was able to guess our symmetric key, and the next hour we're going to create a new one and they're going to have to start again. So UA is fairly in-depth in terms of its security mechanisms, and that's probably about as deep as we'll go in this talk. So if you made it past that, you're doing awesome. So the other piece, we talked about the application layer in the session. So essentially a session in UA is the way to authenticate and authorize a user. When the client connects to the server, he creates that secure channel that we just talked about, and then he creates a session or authenticates with a session. So the client's going to send either username or password, or they're going to send a certificate that identifies them. The server will either accept or reject that depending on its configuration and say, okay, this is a valid client. And then beyond that point, the client can access the system with the set of authority that they're given. So that's the session piece. So that's more the information or the technology of OPC UA. Let's look at how that technology helps us defend against the security threats that we run into. So a big part of that conversation was the public-private key infrastructure, these certificates that we use. And essentially they're making like we said, they're making the information confidential and they're ensuring the integrity of the messages between the client and server. So what that does is it protects against eavesdropping. I can capture packets, but I'm going to have no idea what they mean. Right? It protects against message spoofing. Like no one's going to be able to send me out of the blue a random message that is signed by the client's private key, right? That you won't be able to guess that. It prevents session hijacking because that session is set up after the secure channel is established, so you can't circumvent that. It encrypts the credentials that you use to set up the session, so no one can just sniff raw username and password over the wire. So really that private key infrastructure is a big part of the security design of UA and encrypting the information that goes over the wire. One threat that we did identify was message flooding. This is the easy one where I could just kind of machine gun messages to the server. UA defends against this by, this can be a tough one to defend against, but basically UA does a minimal set of, does a minimal amount of work when a client first connects to the point where they're authenticated. Right? So if I'm just this malicious client, I'm trying to connect and flood it with messages, essentially the server is just going to reject. And after a set amount of time, it's going to say, all right, man, just relax. I'm not going to accept any more connections for a little bit. Wait for everything to clear, and then I'll start up again. It's kind of like your bank account when you mess up your password 3 times in a row, which I do all the time, and then you get the message, oh, go call IT, right? UA server doesn't tell you to call IT, but it'll just have a cooldown period where and the whole idea is we're going to prevent message flooding such that we don't create this denial of service scenario where we reduce the availability of our system, right? And then the message details. We didn't get into this a lot. This is another kind of dense topic of UA, but If I am going to spoof messages, there's a number of things that UA does under the hood to make that really difficult. So there's all kinds of metadata that gets sent in the messages. There's a session ID, so when I authenticate with a session, that has an identifier that's unique. There's a channel ID, so that secure channel that I've created has a unique identifier. There are request IDs, so each request gets a unique ID that gets incremented each time. There's a timestamp on the request, and there's also this concept of sequence numbers because requests can be broken up amongst multiple packets. But the idea is that if I'm receiving a message, I have to check all these IDs, and I have to make sure that, does this make sense? Did I get an ID that's out of order? Did I get an ID that's for a session that I don't even have? And just quickly drop and forget those messages if they don't add up. So that's the way the UA guards against, message alteration and malformed messages and such. So that's it, right? We looked at the threats, we looked at the objectives, we looked at how sites manage security. We looked pretty heavily at UA and how that's used as a technology to prevent or help sites realize security and prevent these kind of threats. So in summary, OPC UA is really, it's an open standard technology that's used to connect systems. It's used to connect hardware to clients and other software applications and machine to machine, et cetera. And it's inherently secure, right? So it's a great technology to use to get information from a secure site over a public domain that's insecure to the end user. And to do that, OPC UA leverages heavily on IT-based security protocols that have been around, or technologies that have been around for a long time, right? And protects against all those threats. So it's a smart technology that provides security, and it's a great solution for remotely accessing sites and the data at sites. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity. I think we'll open it up for some questions. And if anyone doesn't feel comfortable asking questions, you can come up to me after and we can chat about OPC UA and security in general.
Aron, thanks so much for that informative presentation, and we do have some questions from the attendees, so let's get right to them, shall we? The first question asks, are OPC UA servers required to support security?
Yeah, they're actually not. The short answer is no. The long answer is they should, right? It's up to the provider to decide what level of security they want to offer. OPC UA has, it's kind of plug and play in the sense of what you can implement. There are certain clients that just will not accept the connection if it's not secure, right? So it's heavily recommended that you create a secure solution. And the other option, the ideal solution is you get a solution where you can tweak it. You can turn on security or turn it off given your environment. So.
Okay, Aron, your next question is, how do I ensure that the OPC UA applications I deploy implement security properly?
Yeah, so no, that's a good question. So, how do you ensure that any open standard actually works between different vendors? So the way the OPC Foundation does this is there's really two mechanisms. There's a self-test, they call it a compliance test tool, that vendors like Kepware will run on their software to ensure that they meet the specification of OPC UA in terms of security and then all the functionality. And then beyond that, that's kind of a self-certification. Beyond that, the OPC Foundation has an interoperability testing lab where companies like Kepware and other vendors will submit their hardware or software there to be rigorously tested by the OPC Foundation and certified. So that's the way to tell if it meets the security requirements.
Okay, Aron, here's another question for you. How secure is my OPC UA server if it sits on top of an insecure non-OPC protocol like Modbus?
Like Modbus. Modbus is a great protocol. It's very simple. It's very simplistic. It does what it does very well. But if you're sending Modbus packets over the WAN, right, over the internet, yeah, that's inherently insecure. It's really easy to all the security threats we mentioned with Modbus, they're there, and they're fairly trivial, right? So, the recommendation is what you should be doing is at your site level, right? There's a private network in there. If you want to use Modbus to communicate with your devices at the site on the local network, it's fairly secure in there. You control more. That's not a problem. But when you talk about going over a public domain, that's where you probably want to use a technology like OPC UA to secure that communications. So it's not that you can't use Modbus. You still have to, but just isolating that to the local network and using something more secure for the public-facing stuff.
Okay, Aron, I think we have one more. Does OPC UA tie into Microsoft's Active Directory infrastructure?
It does not. OPC UA is a platform-independent solution, so it does not tie in directly to Active Directory. It's not in the specification per se, but it does have a rich security story in terms of creating users and authentication. So what vendors can do is they can tie it into Active Directory and it's as good as it being in the spec. So it can work, and it's up to the vendor to implement that.
Aron, those are all the questions we have time for right now. We'd certainly like to thank you for sharing your time and your insights with us today.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a pleasure. Again, if anyone has any other questions, just come see me. Let's chat. So thank you.
Now, before moving on to explore the exhibit hall of this event, please take a moment to click the Take Survey button and let Aron know how he did today. Your feedback helps us improve the quality of our IHS GlobalSpec events, making them an even better investment of your time. Remember, you can see any of today's presentations during our on-demand period, but exhibitor representatives are only here on the day of the live event, so spend time with them while you can. Please experience our latest innovation, the Knowledge Exchange, offering product demonstrations and our Hot Topic podcasts. The Knowledge Exchange is also home to our Event Prize Center, so make it a point to visit. Share your thought leadership point of view by speaking at one of our events. You can find the speaker submittal form at our event help desk in the exhibit hall. Well, we'd certainly like to thank you for choosing to spend your day with us, and we'll see you back here in the conference center a little later on.